I talked recently about shifts that are happening in seminaries, and this is one of the things that's come up a lot in our coverage of and talking about what happened in Methodism. Well, a lot of the poison dripped in for a prolonged period of time from the seminaries. So, what's to be said about more conservative groups like the Southern Baptist Convention or the Nazarene, the Church of the Nazarene? They have seminaries as well. Are they seeing the same threats? And the short answer is yes. But then specifically, the Institute for Religion and Democracy recently published a piece on Church of the Nazarene and a seminary in their Nazarene Theological Seminary. So I wanted to read over this article, see what parallels there are, what warnings there are for the Nazarenes. Nazarenes, of course, have a background in Wesleyan theology. They come out of the holiness movement, which, to my understanding, preached entire sanctification a lot more faithfully than Methodists did, and believe very much in the power and work of the Holy Spirit, even though they rebuke speaking in tongues. So I'm going to be learning more about that as I read this book by Kevin Watson. I'm maybe a quarter of the way through, and then hopefully whenever I get done, Dr. Watson will say yes to an interview. Sorry, I clipped out for a second. So anyway, I wanted to look over this article, and I'd invite you to learn with me. Nazarene Seminary platforms LGBTQ affirming faculty. So this is written by Elijah Friedemann, who, to my understanding, is on staff at Wesley Biblical Seminary, and whose father is Matt Friedemann, who's an influential Wesleyan thinker. He says the Church of the Nazarene is the largest Wesleyan holiness denomination in the world, with 600,000 members in the U.S. and 2.5 million members around the world. The denomination is known for its conservative positions in theology and on theology and lifestyle standards. However, in recent years, Nazarene Theological Seminary, the denomination's only seminary in the U.S., has made a pronounced progressive shift by hiring LGBTQ plus affirming faculty. So, I don't know if it says where Nazarene Theological Seminary is, but I'm kind of curious. Kansas City, Missouri. I didn't realize they were that close. Okay. As a 31-year-old clergy member in the Church of the Nazarene, I am concerned about the direction of the denomination. I grew up in the Church of the Nazarene. I've spent my ministry serving in local Nazarene churches and hope to die a Nazarene. In addition to being a Nazarene pastor, I've also served as a vice president at Wesley Biblical Seminary. My time in both the local church and the world of higher education has made me deeply aware of how quickly heretical beliefs in the academy can shape the direction of the denomination. It sure is an encouraging thing when people learn from history. For current and former members of mainline denominations, this is an all too familiar story. The liberalization of educational institutions has played a primary role in the theological downfall of denominations like the United Methodist Church. In his book, The Rise of Theological Liberalism and the Decline of American Methodism, James Heidinger outlines how the theological drift at seminaries created scholars and clergy who no longer affirmed the central teachings of the Bible, like sin, the incarnation, and the resurrection. The liberalization of higher education institutions was matched by an unwillingness to hold heretical professors and clergy accountable for their false teachings. The unholy mix of these two factors produced a denomination in which many clergy denied the divinity of Jesus and his resurrection from the dead, and one that now openly rejects the clear teachings of Scripture on human sexuality. So, the part of the Methodist story that I know was around Border Parker Bown, who is a professor at Boston University School of Theology, my alma mater, who denied many historic doctrines of the faith. And faithful, conservative-minded folks tried to force him out of his position and form a check on the seminaries, and were entirely unsuccessful. And that goes back more than a century now, I'm pretty sure. So there's a long history to draw upon here that Mr. Friedman is very wise to learn from. Despite the warnings offered by the long and agonizing history of the Methodist movement of the 20th and 21st centuries, the same problems are at work in the Church of Nazarene today. While the Nazarenes tend to be among the most theologically conservative evangelical Christians, opposing same-sex marriage and abortion at higher rates than even Southern Baptists, some Nazarene educational institutions have been moving in a different direction. In 2023, a book was published entitled Why the Church of the Nazarenes Should Be Fully LGBTQ+ Affirming. The volume was co-edited by Tom Ord, a Nazarene elder and former professor at multiple Nazarene universities who is now facing a church trial for his heretical positions. Well, that's good. Did they write about that? I just hit that link. Yeah, it looks like, let's see, that was published just a couple months ago, not even. He's been brought up on charges and faces an upcoming trial that could result in removal of his credentials as an ordained minister. He's been charged with teaching doctrines contrary to the Church of the Nazarene and with conduct unbecoming of a minister for his efforts to move the denomination to affirm same-sex behavior. The charges are the latest indication that human sexuality disputes that have divided mainline Protestant denominations are also surfacing in Wesleyan holiness churches. So it says he's a professor of theology at Northwind Theological Seminary, an ecumenical online interdenominational seminary with roots in the Wesleyan tradition. Okay, so let's go back to the original article. I'm sure that one's interesting, but we don't have all the time in the world. This book featured essays which advocated for the full embrace of LGBTQ identity and practice. Among the contributors were a group of 17 ordained Nazarene elders, a number of whom were current or former professors at Nazarene higher educational institutions. Perhaps the most prominent of the contributors was Steve McCormick, who had retired from Nazarene Theological Seminary in 2022 after an 18-year teaching career. After the book's publication, McCormick participated in a pro-life LGBTQ conference. No, not pro-life. Pro-LGBTQ conference, where he confirmed his long-standing views in support of LGBTQ identity and practice. Despite his unbiblical views, McCormick remains the Emeritus Greathouse Chair for Wesleyan Holiness Theology at Nazarene Theological Seminary. So this is concerning. I remember when the book came out and they were having their big gathering, I was like, man, I guess the Nazarenes are more liberal than I thought. If they can have people openly advocate for this and publish a book based on this, it doesn't seem like they're towing the line very well. Well, Friedman here is arguing that they are. They're putting people on charge. They're bringing people up on charges, and we're going to hear more, hopefully, about what they're doing to keep their seminary in check. The seminary administration has refused to disassociate from McCormick. Despite his wholesale affirmation of LGBTQ identity and practice, the truth here is sobering. A premier Nazarene theologian at the denomination's only seminary in the U.S., who trained Nazarene pastors and academics for decades, had been affirming for much, if not all, of that time. And over a year, he has made his views public, and NTS has done nothing to remove his emeritus status. NTS is not the first evangelical institution to deal with emeriti, plural of emeritus, faculty who are LGBTQ affirming. Asbury Theological Seminary, an evangelical seminary in the Wesleyan Methodist tradition, has faced with its own errant emeritus professor. In 2015, Steve Harper publicly embraced an LGBTQ affirming position. Harper, who had been a longtime Asbury professor and had also served as vice president at the institution, became a vocal proponent of LGBTQ identity and practice. In response, Asbury removed his status as an emeritus professor. The willingness of Asbury to remove Harper's title contrasts starkly with NTS's refusal to distance themselves from McCormick by removing his emeritus status. Yeah, what's that about? The problems at NTS are not only with former professors, but also with those who are currently teaching at the seminary. Michael Christensen, professor of spiritual formation and discipleship for the Doctor of Ministry program at NTS, openly affirms LGBTQ identity and practice. As far back as 2016, Christensen was publicly posting on Facebook about his support for allowing people who have embraced LGBTQ identity and practice to be pastors. In 2019, Christensen described himself as someone who has advocated for full inclusion of gay and lesbian sisters and brothers in the life of the church since I was in college over 40 years ago. To his credit, Christensen has been open about his stance on full celebration and inclusion of LGBTQ identities and practice. NTS has repeatedly turned a blind eye towards these views, allowing him to continue to teach at the institution. As recently as this spring, Christensen was teaching a D-Min course at NTS. So, yeah, it's good for people to be open and honest about their political, theological loyalties on the front end, so that's not insulting his character. I think that is an insinuated insulting of the character of this emeritus guy who apparently was hiding his views until this last year. So he's just saying it's good to be on the front end, open and honest about this stuff. But then if the institution isn't willing to behave with integrity and is going to insist instead that they welcome an ideology within their walls that is going to destroy the edifice, well, then that is indeed concerning. Frank Thomas was the featured speaker at the NTS Preachers Conference in 2022, and this past fall he was involved in D-Min program at the seminary. As of June 19th, he was still listed as a guest lecturer in African American preaching and rhetoric at the seminary. Thomas is not currently listed, perhaps in response to the recent pressure on the seminary of those in the denomination. On X, formerly known as Twitter, Thomas has written posts in support of abortion and denounced the senators who opposed enshrining same-sex marriage in federal law. He shared a post about Christian Theological Seminary that celebrated open and affirming churches where everyone belongs just as they are. The post includes a graphic that said CTS loves trans kids and was accompanied by hashtags pride, trans love, and trans visibility. So despite public statements in support of the denomination's stance on human sexuality, NTS President Jaron Rowell has allowed Christensen and Thomas to train students at the seminary for years. Even those on the affirming side have recognized the discrepancy between Rowell's public stance on human sexuality and his private actions. So now he's calling out the president of the college. A former NTS employee named Isaac Petty Pierjok, publicly shared his story of working at the seminary. Pierjok had openly embraced a gay identity and was LGBTQ affirming at the time of his employment. He has since married another man. And Pierjok's recounting of the situation, Rowell began to receive pressure from the Nazarene leaders because Pierjok was an openly gay employee. Pierjok writes, quote, continued directing his subordinates to encourage me to recloset myself online in an attempt to decrease those calls, end quote. The seminary administration made clear to Pierjok, quote, that pressure needed to be taken off the president, end quote. When Pierjok refused to acquiesce, the NTS administration finally fired him. Only under intense pressure from denominational leaders was Rowell willing to do the right thing and remove the employee. All of these situations point to a deeply concerning dynamic at NTS. Although the seminary's leadership affirms the denomination's stances on human sexuality in public, they seem to be unwilling to take hard actions behind the scenes until a situation becomes public and uncomfortable. Oh, gee, is that merited here? For many Nazarenes, the problem at NTS can be seen far removed from local church ministry. However, every Nazarene who gives to their local church is financially supporting what takes place at that seminary. Every Nazarene church is expected to invest 5.5% of its income in the World Evangelism Fund. That fund supports the denomination's global missions program and ministry infrastructure, but $1.1 million is given from WEF each year to NTS. When NTS hires an LGBTQ affirming professor or employee, the institution is doing so in part with money that local churches have sacrificially given for world evangelization. This is how it needs to be done. You just have to connect. And the IRD has been doing this for a long time. If more people would read the IRD, they would be much more familiar. They would have been much more familiar over the course of a couple decades with the degradation of the United Methodist Church and PCUSA and the Episcopal Church. They've been doing this work for a long time. A lot of people have just been refusing to read it and think about it and consider it. It's real. And so it's really helpful when they draw the lines of connection so that you understand, if you are part of that structure, where it is that you have authority to impact things. So I think this is great to do. In sum, NTS has a track record of platforming LGBTQ affirming and abortion supporting professors, which extends back for years and continues to the present day. The refusal of the seminary's administration to confront these issues head on raises some challenging questions for the Nazarene church's leaders, pastors, and lay people. Why is NTS so out of step with local churches and pastors that they would welcome these professors? That's one question. 2, why are local churches forced to support NTS? 3, why does NTS President Jaron Roll require outside pressure to do the right thing on human sexuality issues? 4, who is responsible for NTS? Final paragraph. As with all denominational issues, when leaders do not take biblical stands, the responsibility falls to Nazarene pastors and lay people to speak up, share their perspective, and provide healthy accountability to leaders. My hope is that Nazarenes can support our seminary by holding it accountable to the teachings of the Bible and the doctrine of our church. If we want to thrive as an orthodox and missional denomination, we must ensure our educational institutions remain theologically grounded. So, very decent article by I don't know if it's Reverend or Doctor or Mr. Friedman, but it's wonderful to see someone learning the lessons of the past. It's a 31-year-old guy. Those elders in his denomination would do well to listen to him. Very disconcerting to see. It's one of these things you notice in the United Methodist Church. There would be all kinds of people that understood biblical theology and were very faithful, who then got put in the office of bishop, and it's like that stuff just disappeared. And all of a sudden they're institutionalists who care just about keeping the church together and making it sure all the liberals feel comfortable. It's really weird seeing that happen to so many bishops. And there's this similar phenomenon where you have a very biblically based body that starts a seminary, and the people at the grassroots level in the local church, real solid, but then something happens in the seminary where they just decide, we're going to welcome a really hostile ideology into positions of authority here. How this makes sense, I do not know. But it's happened commonly. It's a very common thing, such that a lot of people today will just say, seminaries are just not good for your faith. That traditions that mandate seminaries have shot themselves in the foot. Now, there are many seminaries like Wesley Biblical Seminary that are trying to prove that stereotype wrong. I know United, I know Asbury, all of them have at least had such rhetoric, although there are people to be concerned about in some of those institutions. So this is just something worth looking at for a prolonged period of time. I hope to get a lot more literate at what seminaries there are and talk to more academics and see who is informing the character and work of clergy around the country. So that's just a big, long project that I hope you agree is important.